I've got a question for you, and it should be one that's very easy to answer, but I find myself unable to answer this rather basic question. And that is, what are the point of cities? Why exactly do we have them? Now, I used to know the answer to this. It was fairly obvious for a long time why we had cities. They were hubs of industry and trade. It allowed the centering of manufacturing, of artisans to come together, centering of logistics, of heavy energy load. You had lots of workers nearby. You had ports, you had critical infrastructure. It gave you all of the things that you needed to carry out manufacturing. And also there were knowledge hubs, universities, libraries, intellectuals thrived in cities because it was a hub where you could bring knowledge people together, knowledge workers, the learned type, all in one place. And of course, also, the long-standing function, which was governance and administration. You want to have, your capital cities where you bring together all of your decision makers in one place so that they can very quickly make decisions. Indeed, for many years I worked in the City of London, and that always had a very specific purpose. You have basically a square mile, a concentrated area where you put all the sort of the bankers and the lawyers and the money men like me. And at any time, within 15 minutes, you could assemble all the parties that you needed to do a merger or an acquisition around a table at short notice. You get them all together, you could get deals done quickly. So there was a point to having a city, to concentrating all of the people that needed to get various things done in one place. But something has changed. I mean, a number of things have changed. I mean, first of all, industry has moved overseas. Manufacturing is done in China. It's not done in Western cities anymore. It has become concentrated. Depending on what it is, it's semiconductors, for example, takes place, largely in Taiwan. Cheap plastic tat gets largely done in, Eastern China. Electrical components get done in southern China. Steel manufacturing gets done in India. We just don't have that sort of manufacturing need. As for the knowledge workers, well, they've moved online. My old thing, finance, you can do all of it online. You can be anywhere now in the world. I mean, people do still tend to cluster around London, but again, you don't particularly need to. Some people have moved out and they're doing perfectly fine. And governance, well, it's become sort of bloated and self-serving. The state has become rather excessive, and it has, gone to create various non-jobs or and whatnot. So what are we left with in cities these days? Well, we're left with very high welfare dependency. We've got large populations that basically exist purely on government subsidy, and we all have to pay these large amount of taxes so that we can funnel the most amount of corn syrup down the throats of obese people who don't really serve any sort of function for the nation at all. We've got mass immigration going on these days, and these cities become hubs for immigrants without economic justification. There was a time when, say, for example, the United States, New York, needed a lot of people to come in, and it opened its doors, and lots of people from Northern Europe travelled over to America. They took up sort of useful work in the city, and that's all sort of well and good. But quite often, the people that we're importing now, they don't serve a particular function. I mean, a few of them might get barista jobs, for example, but a lot of them do just go on welfare. So, what is the point of that? And of course, what else have cities become? They've become hubs of lawlessness because, of course, nobody really knows anybody else. So it's very easy for criminals to blend into a city. They've become over-regulated. They've enacted anti-business policies. And they were once cultural hubs. And again, that's been hollowed out as well. They've been so captured by ideological mad left-wingers that they don't do that. I think at this point it's worth recapping, how do we actually get cities in the first place? When I take you through the story, you'll start to see that they really did have a genuine function at one time. There was a time, back in the Middle Ages, when wealth was essentially land, your ability to output food. I remember I did a Broconomics not so long ago on the Roman Empire. One of the points that I made on that is that actually throughout the period that we think of the high period of Rome, the Chinese were significantly wealthier. And that was simply because they had more land of which to grow food and their food output was higher. And back in the classical age, your food output was essentially your wealth. So for the longest time, land, the ability to grow food was wealth. And the power centres in this country would have been the feudal lord and the bishop. Power was tied to the land. Agriculture was the absolute foundation of this. There was trade, largely controlled by, the occasional merchant or the monasteries, but it was, very much a side piece to the main thrust of it, which was, food production. And governance was decentralized. Each local lord under the feudal structure would have, been in control of his particular bit. And yes, there might have been a monarch that sat over the top of it, who, in times of war, would build a coalition of various lords and take them off with him, and plunder and then divide the loot equitably. But yes, the power was the lord and the bishop. They served different function. I mean, the lord was the one who really had the power because, of course, he could, he had the swords, didn't he? He had the swords, and therefore he was the real power. And the bishops provided the justification as to why the Lord should be in charge, because of, divine providence and blah, blah, blah. Well, you get the gist. But, the bishop was basically there to provide the explanation as to why the Lord was really in charge of what was going on. Now, that worked fine up until about the 14th century, when, rather unfortunately, there was the Black Death. It was a bit bad. Many things happened as a result of this, but one of the key things that happened, for our purposes here, is that there was massive depopulation and labour shortages, which had the effect of empowering the workers, because basically they had a better negotiating position because there was fewer of them and they would needed a lot more. As a result, serfdom started to decline. Peasants, they could demand greater wages and freedoms, and basically the local lords had no choice but to do this. And as these freedoms were enacted, they became much greater movement of populations. Towns started to really kick up speed. I mean, yes, we had sort of towns and cities before that, but the drive had significantly increased. And when people moved to towns and cities, they tended to form guilds. You tended to get the artisans emerging as a major player who could produce goods, tools, things of greater value. Cities started to become more and more independent. They would often gain, independent legal status, city charters, because basically the monarchs needed the tax income that the cities could give them. So, you had the emergence of these growing 14th century and onwards great cities. Guilds became the de facto rulers. They imposed protectionist policies to ensure that local artisans and crafts flourished, and of course banking started to emerge in a real way and started to really flourish. The printing press came along, midway through the 15th century, and started to accelerate that knowledge workers grip in the cities as well. So you started to have those sort of knowledge, type people that came through as well. Of course, this continued into the, perhaps the region roughly around the sort of 16th, 17th, and 18th century, when you had the real shift to merchant rule. What was going on here? Well, monarchs were becoming increasingly reliant, in fact, heavily reliant on cities for tax revenues, and ended up having to give them more and more autonomy. And you started to get the banking dynasties emerge. The Medicis, some of the other ones who are still around today, and we're not really supposed to talk about. So, but you know who they are. The old aristocracy was in full retreat at this point, being replaced by bourgeoisie wealth. Corporations started to form and become incredibly powerful. The East India Company was more powerful than many governments of the time. Rivaled even the British state in terms of power at one point. So the merchant capitalists started to dominate, and then we had a shift. Since then, basically, we have been ruled by the merchant, by the banker, and much like in previous era with the lords and the bishops, is the politicians were there to provide the explanation as to why the bankers and the money men were in charge of everything. Um, it's a little bit more complicated these days than divine rule, but you get the gist. The politician is there to say, look, you voted for me, and I do whatever it is that the money men want. And because you voted for me, and it's a democracy, therefore everything is fine. Don't worry about it. The merchants are in charge, and that's how our society works. So then you carry on to the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, when you start to get the Industrial Revolution, and this is when cities are really kicked into high gear. You've got cheap, concentrated labour in one place. You've got these large working class populations, people who are effectively wage slaves. Very good for the industrialists, because these people are not independent in any means. They don't have any land to work. They don't have any sort of independent wealth. They are simply reliant on wages. And of course, if you combine that with democracy and you've got a media class in place, then you can basically steer the votes of those people to make sure that you get the correct outcome, the outcome that you're looking for. So then you get the emergence of not only the knowledge workers, but the media people and the propagandists and all the rest of it. And so, we'd moved from small-scale merchants, which was the original sort of justification for the cities, the artisan class that came in, and now you're dealing with large-scale industrialists. Government has moved on from, guilds to basically large-scale bureaucracies managing urban populations. And so for about 150 years or so, cities were the absolute beating heart of modern nations. Then we hit the 21st century, and it all started to go a bit wrong. Industry had already been moving out, and was moving out quite heavily at this point. Manufacturing was going overseas. Finance, media, and bureaucracy was sort of taking over manufacturing, and for a while that seemed to work. Immigration was being massively ramped up by our political classes, at the behest, of course, of the money men, who wanted ever cheaper labour. So mass immigration has to come along, and they tend to cluster in these cities. And globalism basically turned these cities from, important economic hubs of learnedness and governance and manufacturing and all the rest of it into basically, disconnected economic zones. Just as cultural decay was sort of really clicking in. And now modern cities are essentially host to the type of people who probably wouldn't, probably wouldn't have succeeded in any other point in history, but now they flourish in the modern city. So jobs in media, fashion, diversity, equity, inclusion, or some useless government role. I mean, you know the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And the rise of the non-job. I mean, we now have huge amounts of people who do quite ridiculous jobs, frankly. We've got social media managers, or diversity, equity, inclusion officers, corporate event planners, compliance officers, sustainability officers, telemarketers, life coaches, parking attendants, middle management, public relations, community managers, bloody digital marketing consultants, HR managers, brand ambassadors, productivity consultants. You know what I'm talking about. And that's just in the private sector. You go into the government sector, it's even worse. Government jobs, you've got diversity, equity, inclusion coordinators. I mean, yes, I suppose you get those in the private sector as well. But then you get public affairs, and you get grant writers, and you get community engagement specialists, and sustainability officers, and urban planning consultants, and administrative assistants, and PR managers, and political advisors, and outreach coordinators, public health officials, climate change officers, tourism directors, regulatory compliance officers, digital transformation officers, housing policy advisors, and smart city consultants. I could go on, but you get my point. Genuine knowledge workers don't require the city anymore. They've got good internet. They've got Starlink. They can do it from anywhere, and they don't have to pay the costs of being in cities. And by costs, I don't just mean the heavy rents and land prices. I mean the crime that we've sort of talked about before. So fundamentally, what is a city? A very simple definition of a city is an area which cannot feed itself within its territory. Now, that kind of makes them sound like leeches, but if they are doing something useful, such as manufacturing or knowledge hubs or centres of governance that make everything tick, then fine, you don't mind feeding the cities because they're providing something valuable instead. But what are they now? I mean, they're just hubs for non-jobs, for bloated government jobs, for predatory clusters of government wealth extraction. They're hub for low or no skill immigrants. They're hubs for the welfare dependent, the homeless, the drugs and the crime. And it also leads me to the point where I'm thinking, right, I don't know if you've seen the Watchmen movies or the comic book series, but in that, apparently Dr. Manhattan destroys a whole bunch of cities. And I find myself asking the question, what if he did? What if Dr. Manhattan showed up here tomorrow and destroyed the 5 largest cities in whatever country you're in? Would it be a bad thing? I mean, okay, yeah, don't arrest me, Keir Stummy. Yes, of course, it would be a bad thing. I'm just talking about over the long term for the health of the nation and all that. I don't actually want to see cities destroyed, but let's say they were. 5 largest cities in the UK: London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, Leeds. What would happen if they all just disappeared? 50, 100 years later, would we look back and think, oh my goodness, that was a great loss? Largest cities in the US: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, Detroit. Again, would we miss any of them if they were gone? In 50 or 100 years, would we look back and mournfully rue their loss, or would we say that this was the sort of time that they started to turn things around? You've got to remember that these cities are overwhelmingly left wing. They're overwhelmingly hubs for dispossessed, low skilled immigrants, and they command a lot of political representation. London, for example, there's only 650 MPs in the Westminster Parliament, and it is in Westminster, so it is in London. So, of course, that would be another benefit if Dr. Manhattan came along. But, London commands 73 MPs, which is 11% of the total representation of the country. Birmingham, 10 MPs. Manchester, 9 MPs. Glasgow, 7 MPs. And Leeds, 6. So, collectively, those big 5 cities command 16% of political representation in this country, and they are overwhelmingly left-wing and overwhelmingly used to city-type things, which is basically being over-policed and over-governmentalized and all the rest of it. And I can't do every Western country, but let's take a look at those American cities. New York gets 14 representatives. Los Angeles gets 15. Chicago gets 5. San Francisco gets 1. Detroit gets 1. Collectively, it's not quite as much as in the UK because, of course, the US has more cities. But that 8% of total political representation is going into those cities. And I just think that cities are, these rather useless hubs of economically inactive people who don't really contribute much. And this is a map from the Office of National Statistics in the UK, and I'm zooming in on a bit of London there and looking at the people who are economically inactive. But even if they are economically active the way that we sort of generally define it, i.e., working for the government or in some non-job, as I've already sort of talked about, well, I don't really see that they're economically active as well. So what proportion of cities are people doing stuff which is genuinely actually useful, as in we would miss it if it was gone? So where do we go from here? I mean, are cities going to become basically the capital from the Hunger Games? I think we're going to continue to see an exodus to the suburbs and rural areas. Knowledge workers don't need to be in cities. They can work from anywhere. They can work online. More companies are going online. Remote primarily. And even if you do have a job which is needs a little bit more coming into the office, well, again, why do you really need to be in a particular city? I mean, you could do it outside of a city these days. Transport links are good. You can always move to an area. Our cities can become these sort of dystopian technocratic control areas for, government dependent populations. Yeah, there are still some financial hubs, London and Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and all the rest of it. But again, all of that can be done online. So, are cities even necessary anymore? Why can't we just abandon them? I'm reminded of a brilliant book that I read, The Sovereign Individual. Now, this book was written in 1997, and it had some astonishing predictions that it made. For example, it predicted the rise of Bitcoin. It didn't call it Bitcoin; it called it DigiCash or something like that. But basically, it nailed the rise of Bitcoin amongst a whole bunch of other predictions. And it made the point, well, with the rise of the internet, why are people going to need to stay in? Well, I mean, they took it further than just cities. They said, why are people going to need to stay in high tax countries when they can go and work anywhere? They can get a better standard of living in a cheaper country with lower rates of tax, and yet continue to do economically productive things from anywhere. They made a number of other predictions, some of which I suppose didn't come true. One of the predictions I'm most fond of in this book is that they said because people would be able to move away from high tax countries, that they predicted that at some point governments would fake a virus to lock down travel and make it harder to travel and impose all sorts of new travel restrictions. Anyway, make of that prediction what you will. Like I say, written 25 years ago, and one or two of the things that they said were coming have actually ended up coming. But it's that type of process. Now, I'll tell you why this came onto my radar recently, why I've been thinking about this so much. There was this quite viral podcast that went out with, I think it was Louise Perry and David Betts, who is a professor of, well, Civil War type stuff. And I've just done a Brokenomics on it, where I sort of looked at, the claims made in there and dug deeper into a whole bunch of the literature. If you want to watch that, Brokenomics will be out next Tuesday on the lotuseaters.com on my Brokenomics channel. And I went into it thinking, he was over-egging it, because this David Betts chap was saying that he thinks there's going to be a civil war in the UK. It's inevitable in the next 5 years or so. And when I started looking into it, I started to realise, actually, he might have a point there. All of the ingredients, there are basically 6 ingredients you need for civil war, and the UK has 5 of them. 4 of them incredibly strongly, one of them a bit so-so, and the last one it's missing, but that could emerge fairly soon. So if that's of interest to you, do go and check it out. But the point was, he kind of feels that the key distinction is going to be cities versus non-cities, because cities have become so detached. Cities have basically become hubs for predatory governments and immigrant populations who treat the native population incredibly badly. I mean, you all know the examples: the industrial scale rapes and the murders and everything that goes along with it. But what was key is, he pointed out, it's not very difficult to actually get a government collapse going, because you've got these cities who are dependent on infrastructure, obvious stuff like electricity and gas and water, and this infrastructure is just, well, it's unguarded and it's mapped. Everybody knows where it is, and nobody thought to guard it, because for a long time we basically liked our government, and we would have no reason to attack our cities, because they were our cities, but they're not our cities anymore, are they? They've been colonized by predatory government and chaps from overseas who don't like us very much. Well, neither the government or the chaps from overseas. They obviously don't like us very much. So they're not our cities anymore. So what if that infrastructure were to be targeted? The gas is a particularly easy one to do, but any of them could be targeted. And it's worth bearing in mind that attacks on infrastructure is something that is actually well progressed at this point. So the Blade Runners are a great example of this. You can't put up one of these ULEZ cameras in London without them being hacked off well within 24 hours at this point. I don't know why the Mayor Sadiq Khan is continuing to hammer away at these bloody things when they just get chopped down all the time. But I guess he's stubborn and it's not his money, and therefore he keeps putting them back up again. And, cities versus non-city, civil unrest is hardly an unknown thing. I mean, in my mind, it instantly turns to, was it 2014? There was the sort of civil unrest that there was in Thailand. Now, yes, I know it was more complicated than the way I'm going to frame it here, but if I'm going to reduce it a little bit, you can say that was effectively, the yellow shirts who were largely the city elites, the royalist urban elites versus the red shirts who were, basically they were the non-city folk. And also supporters of the prime minister who was ousted at the time. And yes, I appreciate it's slightly more complicated, but essentially that civil unrest in 2014 in Thailand was between cities and non-cities, and it's not the only example of this. I mean, actually, there's many examples. The Syrian civil war from 2011. Again, I'm simplifying somewhat, but it is largely a city versus non-city. A whole bunch. The Spanish Civil War, 1936, the Mexican Revolution, 1910, the Sri Lankan Civil War, 1983, even the Ukrainian War, I'd say, from 2014 onwards. They were cities versus everybody else. And look, my point is this. The politician and the banker and the cities are becoming, at this point, largely obsolete. They are irrelevant. Now, whether any of this plays out or not is not necessarily my point. The issue is that I cannot make a good case as to why we have cities, why we need them. It feels very much like, we're back at the end of the 14th century when we're not quite sure why we still have feudal lords and bishops, because they're starting to seem a lot less relevant than they once were. Now, look, we still have lords and we still have bishops, but they're just not very important. They don't rule our lives. And it feels like the politician and the banker and the city are starting to go the same way. The action is online. The financial system at some point in the 20 years may very well move on to digital assets, bitcoins and all the rest of it, because quite frankly, it's the only thing we can trust, because we can't trust government money anymore because they just keep bloody printing it all the time. So, look, am I missing something? Because it should be a really simple question, shouldn't it? I should be able to get a really simple answer as to why do we still need cities, and I can't think of one. Now, if I am missing something, and you think this is all incredibly obvious, then tell me in the comments. But quite frankly, I don't think we bloody need them anymore.